All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome back. Welcome back. We are here. We're here with some more MMA DFS picks and lineup advice, DraftKings and FanDuel best bets, tips, strategies, sleepers, everything you need for tonight's UFC card. We're back after a week off. Welcome. I'm Brian Jester, co-founder here at Occupy Fantasy, joined by Jake the Snake, owner of MMADFS.com. Jake, how was your week off? Welcome back.
It was good, man. Get ahead on stuff, get caught up on stuff, man. I like the every other week, man. See if that ever if we ever get past the ESPN deal, we'll see if they ever like back off the 43 cards a year. I don't know, but feel prepared.
I know it's great from a watching perspective, but yeah, from a content creation perspective, and also just a general DFS slate size perspective, yes, we would love to have them every other week. So fingers crossed. But in this video, for those of you that are new, welcome. We're going to break down the main event from a betting and DFS perspective: Nassourdine Imavov and Roman Dolidze. And then we'll talk about the two newcomers on the card, give some context to their background and their fighting style and their resumes. And then we'll play good fighter, bad bad matchup for those fighters that have less than 4 fights in the UFC to give some more context around their fight logs and their DraftKings points per game. And then we'll close it out with our favorite underdog play of the slate. We will go with a fight that you have to target in DFS. Whoever wins is likely to score well. And our stream parlay of the week. So, Jake, let's start with Imavov and Dolidze. Two fighters that I think, I don't want to speak for you. I think we were both initially high on, and maybe that hasn't changed much, but should be a good overall matchup here. How do you see this breaking down for betting and then, more importantly, DFS?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting fight. We've got a lot of unknowns. Like they've seen the championship rounds once between them. Imavov generally, I would say, doesn't have the best cardio, and Dolidze, he's a big guy that used to fight at 205, now fighting at 185, has never seen the fourth round, so you never know how he's going to handle it. But yeah, I mean, they're both pretty solid. Imavov comes in, 28-year-old counter striker, not super high volume, will occasionally mix in takedowns. He's actually born in Dagestan, but he's lived in France since he was 9, so he doesn't have like the Dagestan wrestling heavy style. He just has that in his blood theoretically. But yeah, I mean, it's only the second career 5-round fight for Imavov. The first was against Sean Strickland. He lost the decision. Strickland took that fight on short notice and still outworked Imavov. Imavov did win the 5th round, but I think that was just out of like necessity. Like he was desperate. He knew he lost the first 4 rounds, and Strickland coasted a little bit. So I guess you could say that's sort of encouraging for Imavov's cardio, that like he was still able to push in round 5. But in general, it seems like he slows down after round 2. So I don't think he's necessarily built for 5-round fights. It seems like he's kind of built for finishes in the first 2 rounds and then sort of coasting in the later rounds, even in 3rd-round fights, 3-round fights. He fought at 170 until he joined the UFC when he moved up to 185. So he's tall, but he's not like the biggest 185er. I would say he's kind of filling out some, which makes sense, over time, adjusting to the weight class and everything. Pretty durable. Only time he's ever been finished was a 2016 guillotine in his pro debut. So tough guy to put away. And he's got a pretty decent 72% takedown defense. We have seen him get controlled at times. Like the Phil Hawes fight always stands out to me because, Phil Hawes just do that to a lot of guys, and he controlled Imavov for most of that fight. Imavov did have Hawes hurt, but everyone can hurt Hawes. Hawes was on skates at multiple points in that fight. And rewatching it, I think Hawes was even more hurt. Now that we know how easily Hawes gets hurt, you can see it every time he kind of like gets a little squirrely, like, oh, he's about to be out. Like at the time when I was watching it live, I mean, at least from my recollection, I didn't remember thinking that it was that close to Hawes getting knocked out at multiple points, but he totally was. Imavov almost finished him, ends up losing a split decision. Hawes just kind of held on for the whole fight. But it shows you can control Imavov, and that just goes back to the fact that he was fighting at 170, and now he's going against bigger guys that maybe have the strength advantage over him and can just kind of hold him against the fence, maybe take him down some, but not the easiest guy to take down. On the other side of things, Dolidze is older, 35 years old, comes from a grappling background, but he has a ton of power. I mean, like I said, he was fighting at 205 earlier. He went 2-0 in the UFC at 205, and then he dropped down to 185 in 2021. And he had a rocky start, but then he kind of started picking it up, doing better. There was, some speculation that maybe he was back in the juice. He got busted for steroids right before making his UFC debut. So, like, it's not pure speculation. Like he has done it before. It's like, is he back on? He's living in Georgia. He could be a hard guy to track down for USADA. Like, who knows? He does train in Las Vegas with Chris Curtis and Sean Strickland, who are the last two guys to fight Imavov. So I tried to say it in the Curtis fight, like, oh, they have an advantage. They just fought him. And then Imavov was piecing Curtis up before that clash ahead stopped the fight. So it didn't help that time, but they have prepared for Imavov multiple times. And Dolidze he does his training camps at Syndicate when he's not over in Georgia. But both guys are lower volume. Dolidze does have more grappling, more submission skills that could help him. And at his cheaper price tag, I think that makes him a lot more interesting. And he just looks more durable. Imavov's durable too, but it just seems like Dolidze is just like a brick house. Tough guy to put away. He was fighting at 205 when Imavov was fighting at 170, so the potential size and power advantage. You factor everything with the grappling, the cheaper price tag, the additional power. I see more going for Dolidze, but they're both lower volume guys with sort of unknown cardio. So this could go a lot of ways depending on who can outlast the other. But I do think Dolidze will be looking to grapple. He may find some success on the feet. I think both guys are kind of patient counter strikers, where we could see a lot of feints, a lot of staring, and maybe less volume. That definitely isn't ideal for DFS, and for sure creates the way the fight can bust, regardless of who wins, but especially if Imavov wins, given the price tag. So yeah, I'm more on Dolidze here, not super high on Imavov. I think I'm going to be under on him and over on Dolidze. In low risk, I'm not even stacking it. I'm just playing Dolidze for the fact that he's cheaper, and I don't really think he gets finished. So he's got a high floor, decent ceiling, a good chance he gets value, and I think he wins the fight. So that goes into why I'm playing him in low risk and not Imavov, because I think there's other guys you can play over Imavov around the same price, and the combination of fighters is going to score higher more often than not than stacking. So not stacking in low risk. And in high risk, you don't have to play one. You can almost treat it like a 3-round fight. Obviously, the extra rounds raise the floor for whoever wins, but we get a mid-round finish. It may not score especially well, and both guys historically have relied on first-round finishes to really score well. So I definitely don't think you have to play one in tournaments here.
Yeah, and you look at the combined ownership on DraftKings, roughly 72 to 75% in our projections right now. And that does feel a little high to me, especially with 13 fights on the card. We get the extra fight compared to what we normally get, or the extra 2 fights compared to some of these slates. And it's just even more ways for these fighters to be left out. I think if you're struggling with your player pool, or you're struggling with which low-owned fighters to play or which chalk fighters to fade, to me, Jake, I think it sounds like we're on the same page that a main event fade. The ownership is probably a little higher than it should be. So I think that would probably be the first step to differentiation, especially in larger contests.
Yeah, for sure, man. I definitely think it's a fadeable main event, especially if Imavov wins.
For sure. Jose Morales in the chat says he doesn't know anything about MMA. He's never played before. Where does he start in building a winning lineup? That's a pretty loaded question, Jose. I would just suggest you read our daily plug at OccupyFantasy.com that tells you lineup construction tips for whichever contest type you're playing on FanDuel or DraftKings. That way you can just follow that template. That is the best way, as opposed to us trying to rehash from the top down here. This is a live Q&A, though, so if you guys do have questions, go ahead and throw them in the live chat box to the right of the YouTube screen here. All right, Jake, so I think we covered that pretty well. Let's go on to the newcomers on the card. We have 2 fighters making their UFC debut. First one in the first fight of the night is Thomas Peterson. For those of you who watched tape or maybe just looked at Underdog or Tapology and looked at their fight logs, you'll see that his only loss on his record is to Waldo Cortez Acosta, who is in the UFC now. Jake, Peterson, what is his fighting style, his background, his resume, his chances for DFS success in the UFC?
Yeah, so he's a 28-year-old wrestler. Like you said, coming off a first-round submission win on the Contender Series. That was his first career submission victory. It was from like a key lock, so he kind of likes manipulating arms on the mat, but generally looking for ground and pound. So pretty one-dimensional guy. He needs to get fights to the ground. He looks to beat up opponents there, and occasionally look for submissions via arm manipulation. But he's 8-1 with a 100% finishing rate. But you got to take it with a grain of salt, because he's been fighting a bunch of low-level opponents. And the one time he faced a tougher opponent, which was a one-dimensional striker, so theoretically a great stylistic matchup for him, was Waldo Acosta Cortez. Is it Cortez Acosta? Cortez Acosta. Yeah, it was close. And Waldo knocked him out in the 3rd round. So it was like 2 rounds of, if you go back and watch it, was 2 rounds of Peterson trying to take Waldo down and he had some success, but Waldo kept getting back up. In the third round, Peterson starts to fade and gets knocked out. So not super encouraging because he's basically, when he can implement his game plan, he's really successful. Lots of early ground and pound knockouts. When he can't, kind of helpless on the feet. Maybe not completely helpless, but definitely a fish out of water on the feet. And I would say overall a work in progress. And the guy looks super out of shape on the scales. I mean, he's heavyweight, but still, like, compared to even how he looked previously, like earlier in his career, he was at like 240 pounds. Now he's up at like 265. Just looked like he put on some fat. Not super impressive. I would say I'm definitely getting some fraud vibes from him. I think he's gonna find success in the right matchups, like against like a Josh Parisian or something like that, where it's an easy guy to take down and a guy that doesn't do great off his back. I think he can find success in those matchups. But when he faces other guys that can wrestle at heavyweight, who also have striking, I think he's really going to struggle there. And he's facing a BJJ black belt in Pogues here, and Pogues is really a light heavyweight who just blew up to heavyweight. So I mean that's one thing that theoretically could help Peterson. I mean, we'll see how that works out, but stylistically, I think it's a tougher matchup for Peterson going against a BJJ guy.
Yeah, and as Nicholas in the chat says, Pogues looks shittier on the scales than Peterson. Not sure what that says though. Yeah, anytime you're battling who looks worse on the
That's
scales,
fair.
that is certainly tough to discern how they're in or out of shape will impact the fight. Next we have Markel Medeiros, who is making his debut as well. Jake, talk to me about his fighting style and his level of competition pre UFC.
Yeah, this guy's pretty interesting. 27-year-old guy making his debut following a first round knockout win on the Contender Series against a wrestler that looked honestly shredded.
Yeah.
Um, and, Madero showed really good takedown defense in that fight, like just really tough to get down. And then when he had a chance to get a knockout, he landed it. So he's 8-1 with 6 knockouts, only turned pro 2.5 years ago. So still like a work in progress, still pretty green, but he's training at Factory X with a bunch of, really high level guys. And you can see it in his style. He always comes out with a leg kick, basically. Like, I would be surprised if the first thing he doesn't do in the fight today is come out, throw a leg kick. Which if you're his opponent, it's not great to just do that every time because you can just set up like an overhand. But it just shows that he's kind of smart. He's going to chip away at your legs. He's going to wrestle when he needs to. He's got good hands, good boxing. He trains with, Chris Gutierrez, Jonathan Martinez, all these guys that throw really good leg kicks at Factory X. And yeah, well-rounded. I think he's got potential. I still think he's kind of a work in progress. Like, you can see little like snippets of his teammates in his game, like Zalal, Gutierrez, Martinez. Like, he kind of looks like Yusuf Zalal if Zalal ever went to the gym, basically. But I think he's a pretty interesting prospect. The one thing is he doesn't normally land a ton of volume. Like, he'll look to wrestle enough that it's harder for him to put up a ton of volume. But this matchup definitely lends itself towards more volume because we just saw Landon Quinones absorb 171 significant strikes in his UFC debut, and that guy's crazy hittable. So I don't want to completely call Medeiros low volume. Then he comes out and lands like 120 significant strikes and lands 3 takedowns
Right.
because it's the perfect matchup for that. But in general, he's a little bit slower paced, relies more on good footwork, not getting hit. But he does fill up the stat sheet between wrestling, leg kicks, boxing, and he's definitely shown the ability to get guys out of there. But he fights smart enough that I think there's going to be some decisions where he just, he knows how to win and he goes in there and does enough to win, but not necessarily always getting these finishes that we've seen on the regional scene against a lower level of competition.
That's fair. And our model likes Quinones a lot, but rates both of these guys relatively the same. We have seen some line movement against Medeiros, correct? So I think we'll see Medeiros relatively low owned, especially compared to the fighters directly above him.
Yeah, I mean, that's another reason I like him, actually, is we have seen some line movement for Quinones against Medeiros. So I think we are going to get him at low ownership. And he's not super expensive. 8.5K is kind of in that middle range where he can score 95 points and maybe still end up in the winning lineup if he can get a decision win where he lands 4 takedowns, is 6 minutes of control time, lands 80, 90 significant strikes. So I like him a lot. And I think the lower ownership just adds to his tournament appeal.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, a couple people in the chat. Andres, Alexander, Boofy. Alexander says, "What's up, Occupy Squad? Who's the below 8K fighter you think breaks the slate?" Let me see. I think Jake's answer is Charles Racky. Am I correct?
Yeah, I was just before we went on, I was just hyping up Radke. So yeah, I like Radke. Can't wait for him to get submitted in the first round. Now that I've been like hyping him up so much, but yeah, that's my guy.
That's fair. I'm trying to think of my exposures here. I don't have them offhand. I have a little bit of Pete Rodriguez, who Boofy believes is the answer. Belbita, I have a decent amount of. And I'm technically, because of just I'm a contrarian player, Jake Pogues, Johnson, those types of players. Lots of Quinones, Dober. I think this is a pretty live dog card. It wouldn't be shocking to see multiple of the guys I just mentioned put up 90, 100 points.
Yeah, I think we have a ton of live dogs, man. I think it's a great card for DFS and betting just because there's so much parity, because there's so many live underdogs.
Absolutely. All right, guys, we're halfway through the show. We're almost halfway. We're going to hit on the fighters that have less than 4 fights in the UFC, give some context to their stats, and we will finish off with the underdog play of the slate, fight that you have to target in DFS, and our stream parlay of the week. If you have further questions, don't be afraid. Throw them in the chat. Say hi if you're watching. We would love to hear from you. So this will be rapid fire, Jake. Is a fighter good or bad? And is this a good or bad matchup? This, again, for those of you who haven't seen our show before, this is just to give context to their DraftKings points per game and their fight logs. So starting from the first fight of the night to the last fight of the night, we already talked about Peterson in this matchup, but Jamal Pogues, is he good or bad? And is this a good or bad matchup?
Yeah, I think he's bad, and the only time he's going to be good is when he can get his grappling going. And going against a wrestler is not a great time for that, so I'm going to call it a bad matchup.
Fair enough. We've talked about Medeiros and Quinones already, but is Quinones good or bad? And do you think this is a good or bad matchup for him?
So the thing I'll say about Quinones is I was like incredibly low on him before his debut. So there was only room to go up, and he like exceeded expectations, but I still think he's bad, man. He is crazy hittable. I think he had like a Chris Mutino type performance where like, he survives and
Yeah.
then everyone thinks he's good and then he gets knocked out like immediately in his next fight there potentially. So I think it's a bad fighter and a bad matchup for Quinones.
Not sure you ever want to be compared to Chris Moutinho. So moving on, we have a battle with two fighters that have less than 4 fights in the UFC. Blake Builder and Jung Young Lee, who has just the one fight and only scored 50 points in his debut, assuredly will keep his ownership down. Is Lee good or bad? Is Builder good or bad? And is this a good or bad matchup for either?
Yeah, I think Lee is good, man. I think that guy is super dangerous. The only issue is he doesn't throw much volume and he almost never lands any takedowns. So he's super dependent on getting finishes, but he's really dangerous and really good at getting finishes. You can go either way on Builder because like he's never been finished and he's one of these guys that sometimes will just circle outside the octagon and ruin fights.
Yeah.
But we've also seen him get knocked down 3 times in a round. So I think it's a very volatile matchup where it's kind of a low floor, high ceiling spot for Lee. But I still think that Builder is overrated. And because we've seen him get knocked down so many times before, I still think it's a decent matchup for Lee. And when you factor in the ownership and the upside and just everything together, I think it's a good fighter and a good matchup.
And what were the stats that you put in your write-ups at MMADFS.com and in our daily plug at OccupyFantasy.com regarding Lee's finishes and the timing before his UFC debut?
I think he had like 3 in like 42 seconds or less or something.
I mean, there goes the quick win bonus at 20% ownership potentially. So something to keep in mind. All right, moving on. We now have another matchup of pure talent. Pete Rodriguez and Temba Garembo. Are these guys good or bad? Is this a good or bad matchup for either?
Yeah, so they're both bad, but there's levels to being bad. And Pete Rodriguez is the baddest of the bad fighters. So
Fair.
I don't think Garimbo is good for the record. I think he's wild and reckless on the feet. He's like a blue belt on the mat with 1 submission since 2015. But this is like the best matchup you could ask for. And he is good at controlling guys. And he does have some power with his wild striking. And the UFC wants to build him up because this guy is like the humanitarian of the year. Every time he wins a fight, he puts the money into helping his village in Zimbabwe. He's building wells. He's curing diseases. He's building a library. Like, it's such good PR for the UFC that they are financially motivated for him to win because they need to keep him on the roster because it's going to look terrible if this guy goes 1-3 and they cut him.
True.
Like that, they can't have that. So they're going to give him the easiest matchups they can. They gave him Takashi Sato, who gets submitted by everyone, and Garimbo just could not submit him. He did knock him down. He did control him. He did take him down, but he couldn't finish him, which is a bad sign. But now they're like, okay, well, how about Pete Rodriguez? Like, this guy's never been in a fight that lasted longer than 3 minutes. The only guy he beat was Mike Jackson, who's a photographer, not a fighter. So
Hey,
it's
no
an
Mike Jackson
absolutely
slander on the
dream
channel.
matchup.
Come on now. No Mike Jackson slander.
Yeah, you owe Mike Jackson a beer.
Yeah, or two, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, Pete Rodriguez, the one thing is he has heavy hands, but he's caught in between two weight classes. He's too stocky for 155 and he's too short for 170. So I think he's such a one-dimensional power puncher that, I mean, maybe he could catch Garimbo, but I think Garimbo is just going to tie him up with grappling until Rodriguez gasses out, which won't take long. And at that point, Garimbo can probably do whatever he wants. I mean, we'll see. We've never seen Pete Rodriguez in a longer fight, so all we can do is speculate. But I think it's a bad fighter and a good matchup for Garimbo. And, it's a bad fighter and a bad matchup for Pete Rodriguez because Garimbo is going to grapple. And that's going to make it hard for Rodriguez to land the knockout he needs to win and score well.
Fair enough. Boofy says Garimbo has gotten soft since he got that free house from The Rock. And PK Delta says Rodriguez hasn't been training since 2002. Insider info, so Garimbo's a lock. So lots of narratives around this fight for sure. Next, we have Azat Maxim in the 8th fight of the night against Charles Johnson. And Jake, you and I were high. For those of you who watched our video when Maxim made his debut, if you read our content, you probably realize or remember that we were high on him for his takedown potential. Really disappointing DraftKings performance, just 59 points as a big favorite in his debut against Tyson Nam. Is he good or bad? Does that change your perception? Or maybe I'm just misremembering your perception. And is this a good or bad matchup against Charles Johnson?
Yeah, no, you had that all right. I mean, I think we got to look at the context, right? Like he was going against Tyson Nam, who had never been taken down in the UFC, and you could argue that Tyson Nam hadn't faced many wrestlers, and that was my hope that like, okay, well, he hasn't been taken down, but he also hasn't faced any grapplers like this. But now Tyson Nam's takedown defense definitely held up, and he showed that he does have a really good takedown defense. And a lot of people thought Nam won that fight. It was close. Nam outlanded him, but the difference was basically leg kicks versus damage to the face. So it could have gone either way. I think a lot of the times when they have these undefeated guys, they want to keep them undefeated. It's almost like the champ status. Like you got to like actually beat the champ. You kind of got to beat the undefeated guys because the judges are like, oh, well, he's still undefeated. They kind of lean towards undefeated, in my opinion. I could be wrong. A lot of these close split decisions seem to go towards the undefeated fighters because the judges don't want to be like stealing that record on a split decision. But whatever. Either way, that was a tough matchup. It was his debut. The guy spent almost his entire career fighting in Kazakhstan. So, like it was a big change coming to the U.S. Now he's in his second fight, and now he gets a much, much easier matchup for landing takedowns. Charles Johnson has been taken down so many times in the UFC. It is absolutely insane that he is even willing to accept a fighter against a grappler. Yet here we are, for Charles Johnson fighting for his job. Last fight on his deal. He has to win or else he's going to get cut here. So we'll see what happens. Charles Johnson didn't have a lot of confidence in himself finishing Azat. He was like, yeah, I'm going to win. It's going to be by decision. It's like, cool. All right, super confident, man. Yeah, cool. So I still think Azat is a good fighter. I think he just had a tough matchup last time. I think this is a great matchup. So I think he's a good fighter, good matchup.
Fair enough. All right, moving on. We've talked about Raki already as your favorite fighter to break the slate as an underdog. He's up against Gilbert Urbina. Are these guys good or bad? And is this a good or bad matchup for either? Clearly, you think it must be a good matchup for Raki, or that could just be an indictment of your opinion of Urbina's skill set.
Yeah, I just think Urbina's a fraud, man. I think he's got like 1.5 rounds of cardio, and he beat Orion Kosi. Like, what does that truly mean? Like, anyone can beat Orion Kosi. And even in that fight, Urbina was slowing down in round 2. Kosi had a rib injury, and Urbina had a great round 1. Absolutely amazing round 1. Hurt Kosi's rib in that round, and then they come out in round 2. It's super slow pace. Kosi just like was waiting to get knocked out. Urbina lands like a body kick, and Kosi just crumples to the ground. If that's not Orion Kosi, I think Urbina is getting finished in the second round there. He's got a history of losing, in the second round. If you go back to like the Trayshawn Dorr fight, the Brian Battle fight, we just have seen this guy fade in round 2 and get knocked out, get knocked down, get submitted. He comes from a long line of fraudulent fighters in his family of guys that failed on the Ultimate Fighter. He failed on the Ultimate Fighter. He got knocked out in the second round. He was a backup because Trayshawn Dorr dropped out. Then he lost in the finals as a backup, and then he beats Orion Kosi, and suddenly we think this guy's good. Like, no. Like, I know he was fighting at 185. He's back to 170 now, and he looked good in that first round. I think it was a mirage. I think Radke looked absolutely terrible in his win over Blood Diamond. But this is just I'm targeting Urbina here more than I'm saying that Radke is necessarily a great fighter. But I just think people are going to be low on Radke. They're going to be too high on Urbina. It's a perfect leverage spot. I'm going to be playing basically anyone against Urbina, and I think Radke, he's a BJJ coach at his gym, and he's got good power. So I think he's set up to survive the first round and then knock Urbina out in round two once Urbina slows down. So I think I'm not even ready to say Radke's a good fighter, but man, it's a great matchup. And I think Urbina is a bad fighter. And I think it is a bad matchup just because Radke does have the jiu-jitsu background. He has more power. I think he can survive early. I hope he can. I'm going to be in trouble. If Urbina gets the first round submission, we're going to have a bad day.
All right, fingers crossed for that not to happen. Nicholas says, seen a lot of love from Mahmoud Muradov. Thoughts on that matchup with Hizriev? Great question. That's an excellent transition into the final fighter of the good fighter, bad fighter segment. In Alyaskrov Hizriev, who has one fight, he is also undefeated, put up 104 points against Denis Tululin in his debut. Is Hizriev good or bad? Is this a good or bad matchup for Muradov? And how do you feel about Muradov, who you have projected for pretty high ownership for an underdog? How do you see this fight playing out? Is Hizriev good or bad? Is this a good or bad matchup? And how do we handle Muradov's likely popularity?
Yeah, this one's really interesting, man. This is a pivotal fight on the slate, and I think it's super volatile. So I'll just go over the whole fight. So the deal is Hizriev fights once every 2 years, going back to 2018. Like, it's amazing how infrequently he fights. The last time he fought was 2 years ago. It's Denis Tululin, who one of probably the worst grappling on the UFC roster. A guy stepped in on short notice for that fight. And even in that fight, like, Hizriev couldn't finish him in the first round, even though he got him down. Had to go into round two, was definitely gassing out, but so was Tululin. Like, Tululin gasses in all of his fights, let alone the fact that he was on short notice. So Hizriev still was able to submit him in round two, but man, he was so close to just being spent that I think if that was not Tululin in front of him, the guy would have been in a lot of trouble. So I mean, he's just a total front runner. Like, he's a freight train. If you let him start going downhill in the first round, I mean, he's a complete bowling ball. Like, he should be fighting at 170. That's where he used to fight. In his last few fights, he just moved up to 185 because he doesn't want to cut weight. He fights once every 2 years. Why do you want to, stay on a diet all the time?
Fair enough.
But he's a really good Russian grappler, really good wrestler, really good ground and pound. He'll look for submissions, and he's just super dangerous in the first round, maybe the first round and a half. But after that, man, I think he's going to fade really hard. So that just makes it so volatile because he could score 130 points in a first round finish if he gets a late first round finish after landing 60 ground strikes, or he could completely gas out in round two or round three and get knocked out, which we haven't really seen because he just hasn't been fighting enough to get exposed. I mean, he's 12-0, but was it 3 fights or something since 2018? I mean, that's not enough to really answer a lot of these questions. So a lot of uncertainty on his side. And other side of things, Muradov, really good striker. And I don't know if people think he's a wrestler now just because he took, what's his name? Brian, whatever his name is, down like, I can't remember his name. Is so bad. He took him down 13 times in his last fight because everyone takes him down. I mean, that's just how those fights go. But like prior to that, Muradov had been really struggling on the mat against grapplers. He's been submitted 4 times in his career. He had lost 2 fights in a row to grapplers just before that Brian Barberena win. So I think we're going to get a lot of recency bias on people thinking Muradov's a good grappler. He's not. He just took advantage of a favorable situation. But what he is good at is finishing guys late. He's really big, strong, powerful. He's like the opposite of Kizriev. He's like huge and jacked and shredded, and he's almost entirely a striker. But he's shown a little bit of wrestling. I mean, he showed a lot in his last fight, but again, purely based on who he was fighting. He's not going to do that to most guys. So we'll see. It's interesting. I think it's either going to end in a Kizriev, submission or knockout in the first 7 minutes, or I think Muradov's going to outlast him and knock him out in the second or third round. So, I mean, it's going to be hard for the fight to bust, which, the fight right now we have it projected both guys right around 35, 36, 37% owned, which when you get a fight like that where it's over 70% combined ownership, you'd like to look for ways that bust. I think it's trickier. Maybe Muradov gets like a poorly timed early third round knockout and scores like 75 points, and we get a bunch of other dogs winning, and he still gets left out. But definitely at his cheap price tag, it's tougher. Um, so yeah, I think it's a really interesting fight. I think getting it right is going to be pretty pivotal here. I'm personally thinking that Muradov gets a late knockout, but I mean both guys are live and both guys are going to be popular, so it's a tricky spot.
It's extremely tricky. And for those of you who are wondering, how the hell can I fade this fight after Jake just explained that, I will say that if you're not a member of OccupyFantasy.com, go do so. But our model is not as high on this fight as I would have expected. So maybe that can give you some justification in not playing this fight if you're playing multiple lineups and you want to be underweight, or you're playing just one lineup and you're looking for ways to get different. So, all right, moving on. We have three final quick segments to get to. Before we do that, there's a question from Jack in the chat. Anyone stand out as a FanDuel MVP? I know you listed a good chunk in the daily plug, Jake. But let's say you're playing the $3,000 or $4,000 to first contest. Who do you think is the best when you combine ceiling plus likely ownership on FanDuel?
Yeah, it's tricky because no one really stands out as being exceptional. I think Molly McCann is interesting just based on her ability to like completely fill up the stat sheet. Lee is pretty interesting based on his early finishing upside. But yeah, I was actually looking at that earlier, and it's definitely a tricky slate because like you have Silva, all the way at the top. I don't think she's a good option necessarily unless she's just like too tentative with her striking, would circle way too much. Garimbo's a grappler. Randy Brown, no. Imavov, no. Urbina, no. Like Moicano, I think he's in play for sure if he gets a submission and we see like a high volume striking battle and then a submission. But ultimately, I think there's like a handful of guys, which is why I listed more than normal in the plug. And I think it's kind of a crapshoot as to who gets there. But if you want like the safer option, it's probably McCann. I mean, I say that she's cutting down to 115 for the first time, so that's always a volatile undertaking. But if you want the risky option, I kind of like Lee here. But if he doesn't get that finish, he's gonna not score very well, and that's a really high risk play.
Yeah, and to that point, Jack and anyone else playing FanDuel, if you're not playing the mass multi-entry GPP, and mass multi being very loosely defined on FanDuel with a number of entries there, but if you're playing a smaller contest, it is more important that you just get a winner in that MVP spot. So no problem with playing a higher money line play there. And there are so many other ways to get different in your flex spots. And we know people play FanDuel pretty suboptimally anyways. So if you're deciding, just go with the higher money line. As long as it's a similar type of ceiling, you can always get different in your flex spots. So all right, before we move on to stream parlay, underdog play, fight that you have to target in DFS, just a quick reminder, check out Jake's work at MMADFS.com. He has the sheet where he writes up every single fight for every slate, betting and DFS breakdowns. So go check that out. Also has premium content for your consumption. OccupyFantasy.com, the daily plug, is a roadmap to the slate for DFS that Jake writes as well, plus our Occupy model with rankings and projected ownership, and our lineup builder that allows you to build up to 300 lineups using our optimal lineup criteria and Occupy model value. So make sure you check that out if you want that extra edge beyond this video. So underdog play, Jake. We've been doing prize picks. We're switching over to underdog here. Remember, if you don't have an underdog fantasy account, you can use promo code Occupy now to get a 100% deposit match bonus up to $100. And the nice thing about it, Jake, I know you said both for any of the parlay pick sites that it wasn't a great UFC slate for it. But the nice thing is you can always parlay it with any other sport. You can use our OccuProp radar to find spots that stand out. Jake, if you had to pick one for underdog today, which prop are you looking at, or which line are you looking at?
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, the reason that I think it's not a great underdog prize pick slate is because there's so many volatile spots where you can get like plus 500 props for betting, which is awesome, and you can get low owned plays for DFS, which is great. But in terms of 50-50 over unders, volatility isn't necessarily your friend, which
Right.
makes it a little bit trickier. But I like the Randy Brown over an underdog. It's over 14.9 minutes. He's been, I think his last like 4 wins went the distance. Stalikov similarly has been going to a lot of decisions in his wins. Knocked out Andre Fiallo, but who hasn't? So I think there's a good chance we hit the over there, even though it's like negative 130 or something. Like ideally you would get a little bit, you get a line that's like negative like 140, 150 or something in terms of picking a side, but it's not terrible. And I just think that fight probably goes the distance unless Brown like randomly gets a sub or gets like clipped with a spinning heel hook kick or something to the face. So I like the over there.
All right, sounds good. Now, we talked about the Hizriev and Muradov fight. Obviously, we've discussed the main event. Are there any other fights that stand out to you as a fight that you have to target in DFS where whoever wins is likely to score extremely well?
Yeah, I mean the other one's obvious too. It's the co-main with Moicano Dober. I mean, I think the whole world is on either Moicano by rear naked choke or Dober by knockout, which definitely gives me trap vibes when everyone is just assuming that a fight is that binary,
Right.
but it definitely seems that way. I mean, Moicano gets knocked out in all of his losses, gets rear naked chokes in all of his wins. Dober gets submitted in all of his losses basically and gets knockouts in all of his wins. I mean, there's exceptions, but typically that's, you can get the full stats on my site, but typically that's the gist of it. So it sets up perfectly, maybe a little bit too perfectly for one of those two outcomes, but I definitely think that you're going to want to have exposure to both sides. I mean, the field will too, so it's not a hot take there.
Absolutely not. All right, let's move on, and we'll close it out with our stream parlay of the week. I will pick a prop side or total. Jake will as well. We will parlay it together. If you want to sweat it with us, you can certainly tail on your favorite sports book. So, Jake, I'm going to go Timber Garimbo by KO or decision, banking on the sub equity being too high in his prop lines compared to his money lines. That is a FanDuel only play, but that would be my side of the stream parlay.
Yeah, I love it. It's plus 200 on FanDuel. They do offer that on other sites, but the line's not as good. It's just under like the two-way props or multi-way props. But yeah, I really like it, man. The guy has one submission win since 2015. He's a blue belt, and they're just automatically saying he's going to sub him, which seems weird. I kind of think he wins the decision. I could definitely see him knocking Pete Rodriguez out if Rodriguez just turns into a pumpkin after 3 minutes. But either way, you got to like plus 200 when the guy's money line is negative 250 and you get two of the three possible outcomes.
Right.
And honestly, probably the two most likely outcomes. I mean, maybe. I'm going to go with Medeiros by decision at plus 320. That line seems off to me. I don't get it. He's the favorite. I know he has 6 knockouts, only 2 decision wins, but Quinones has never been finished in his career. Like I said earlier, Medeiros is, he fights smart. He'll tie people up. He'll wrestle when he needs to. I think that sets up pretty well for him to win by decision, and that line seems way too wide. So if we pair those two together, it's plus 1160 on the parlay.
Love that. All right, let's get a win under our belt for the stream parlays. That'll do it for this video. Again, for more information, check out MMADFS.com and OccupyFantasy.com for all the in-depth info that we couldn't cover in this video and strategies for all contest types, all sites, betting or DFS or prop parlay sites. Go check out our sites. You can follow Jake on Twitter at DFS_MMA. I'm at Brian Jester FF, as well as at Occupy Fantasy. Thank you, everyone, for listening. We appreciate you. Again, make sure you subscribe to the channel. We're doing these videos every time there are 12 or more fights on the card, especially now with the NFL almost being done. So make sure you subscribe to the channel to get notified whether we upload it Friday night or go live on Saturday afternoons. And give us a thumbs up. We appreciate that. Any further questions, you can certainly comment on the video, but there's only a couple hours before the slate starts. Discord is the best way to get in touch with us and sweat out the fights with us. OccupyFantasy.com/Discord. That link is in the description below. So for Jake, I'm Brian. Thanks for listening, and good luck at UFC Vegas 85.